Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I'm the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
Here we go, Josh.
All right. So today we're going to talk about Peter Farrelly's new movie, Green Book, which stars Viggo Mortensen, Mahershala Ali. Viggo Mortensen plays like an Italian-American guy who is hired by Mahershala Ali's character, an African-American piano player, or pianist, I guess, for being formal, to drive him through the southern areas of the country while he performs, and kind of like hires him to be protection and to help him get through all of his dates, his performing dates. So I guess it's won some Golden Globes since it's won Best Screenplay and Best Motion Picture Musical or Comedy, because Golden Globes does that weird thing. And then Best Performance by an Actor in a Supporting Role, Mahershala Ali. So I guess I'll start off there. Like, do you feel like Mahershala Ali is a supporting character in this, I guess? Or do you feel like it's more of like a two-hander?
I'm somewhere in between with that. I see why he's relegated to the supporting actor role. The movie is from Tony's viewpoint. It's Tony's story.
Yeah.
But the way that I classify it normally is with the supporting character. If you can remove that supporting character's subplot from the movie, could you still tell the story? And obviously you can't tell the story without Mahershala Ali's character. Lucky for us, because he's a master at what he's doing in this film. So I did think about it. I understand why they chose to do that. And they do that sometimes at the Oscars. They split up the performances, even though it's a two-handed movie. Without one, you couldn't have the other. It's like Notes from a Scandal.
Notes on a Scandal.
Notes on a Scandal?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, is that what it's called? It's been years. Judi Dench and Cate Blanchett. Cate Blanchett has as much, if not equal, screen time and as important of a character, but she was supporting and Judi Dench was leading. So, Carol, once again, another Cate Blanchett movie with Rooney Mara, who was nominated for supporting actress, and she's the lead in that movie. It's her story. And Cate Blanchett was nominated for Best Actress in Carol. So I don't quite know how to classify it, but this one I kind of understand why they did what they did, and I'm fine with it. Mm-hmm. And it could give Mahershala Ali a second Oscar for a performance he definitely deserves. So I'm okay with that. He's not as prominent of a character as Tony is. And I think that's why, maybe prominent's not the word. He's not as forceful of a character as Tony is, because obviously their personalities are completely different. So maybe that's why. But it doesn't bother me in this one. Did it bother you?
Well, I didn't pay too much attention to the Golden Globes, but I just, in reading that just a second ago, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And maybe it was a strategic thing where it's like, would we be able to get a win with putting Mahershala Ali in the supporting actor category versus the lead actor category, and if it was a strategic move, I mean, I can see that. But I mean, you're right. The movie is about Tony Lip, or his last name's actually Vallelonga. But yeah, I mean, the movie's about him. It's not specifically, and it's about the journey that he goes through. And it's actually written by his son, or I think it's his son, written by his son. So, so it's one of those things where it's, told from his point of view, and the character that Tony Lip bounces off of is Mahershala Ali's character, Dr. Don Shirley. And I also didn't say that this is a true story. So, I mean, at least it's based on a true story. So, of Tony Lip being hired to drive Dr. Shirley down and through these areas of the country. So I guess I don't know. I don't really care about the Golden Globes that much, but I guess I don't. It's probably the same thing is gonna happen with the Oscars. You think, where they're gonna put him out for?
Yeah, definitely, because he's nominated for. They're nominated in the same categories for the Screen Actors Guild, and also Mahershala Ali won the Critics' Choice Award as Best Supporting Actor. So yeah, that's where it's going with that. And in the long run, it's not important, but it does make it for a confusing conversation sometimes. I always reference Paper Moon. Have you ever seen that movie with Ryan O'Neal
No,
and Tatum
O'Neal.
O'Neal? Yeah, his real daughter plays his real daughter in the movie. She won supporting actress, and she was one of the youngest of all time to win supporting actress. And without a shadow of a doubt, she's the lead in the movie. It's actually her movie. And then Madeline Kahn is also in that movie, and she's great, as she always is. And she's nominated also that year for supporting actress. And when you watch Paper Moon, you realize very quickly Tatum O'Neal is the lead character. But you're like, okay, she's a little girl. I can see how people got confused. There's some weird justification for it. She won Best Supporting Actress. Then you see Madeline Kahn's performance, and you go, that's the supporting actress nomination that should have been, which it was, but she's supporting the two leads performance or story. So it gets a little muddled and it gets a little confusing. It's like, I think Julianne Moore was nominated for supporting actress for The Hours, and Nicole Kidman was won for best actress for The Hours. And it's Julianne Moore's movie, no doubt about it. But I mean, in the long run, if these people get recognized, I'm good with it, whatever happens. So
Yeah. So how'd you like the movie?
when I came out of it, I texted you, Green Book works. Let's do a podcast about it. You said, okay. And it's a feel good movie. So I felt good and I enjoyed, and I've talked about this many times before, that a movie that is lacking something in the screenplay or the direction or something's not working about it, the performances can save it for me. And that's what this movie is for me. I started to really pick it apart and started to think about it. And I think some of the backlash has started to sink in, and we'll get there. And I have some questions about that, the backlash and why these things happen. But I started to think about the film and I started to go, it's not gelling afterwards as much as I thought it would be. But my first reaction to it was, I learned something about myself. I learned something about two characters I didn't know anything about. I don't know anything about Mahershala Ali's character, Dr. Don Shirley. I don't know his music. I don't know anything about him. So as a character study, I loved it. As a movie or a biopic or a buddies movie or a road movie, it's okay. It's not the greatest. And by the way, it just won the PGA, the Producers Guild of America award. And that is much more of an indicator of what will win Best Picture than almost anything else in the Oscar race. If you're going to look at it from statistical breakdowns, I think it's like 90 some odd % of the PGA winners go on to win Best Picture.
Wow.
So do I think it's a Best Picture? No. Do I think it should win Best Picture? No. Do I think it should be nominated? Sure. When there's 10 of them? Sure. But something is missing from this movie when you start to think about it. And it's not that it's a bad movie. It's lovely. It's fine. It's a fun 2 hours. It's a hard 2 hours in places. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say there's levity all the way through it. It's not a Farrelly Brothers film. That's for sure. But there's something, and I can't put my finger on it. Something about it started to make it very disjointed when I started to really think about it. So what'd you think?
So, I mean, for me, we've obviously been talking about a lot of movies recently that have to do with race and that have to do with the relationship between races, and also that are period pictures, all within this same kind of like 60s, 70s area. I just got done watching If Beale Street Could Talk, and and that's the same kind of area. And so the day after I saw this in the theater, I rewatched Black Klansman, and that was our last podcast. And so it was interesting seeing those two movies, in one after the other, and it kind of helped me to kind of pick out a little bit of what I uh, felt weird about Green Book to me, or felt wrong to me. I think that it's the movie's heart is in the right place, and I think that it's an accessible movie, and I think that it's a more accessible movie maybe than Black Klansman, because maybe people don't want to go to a movie where there's a bunch of people in robes and stuff, but still, I think that here's what I'm going to start with. Two great performances by Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali. Amazing performances, and I think they both did what they were asked to do, and they did it really, really well. And I mean, I love both of those actors. Would watch them in anything. So, but that being said, I think that there are certain things that are being dumbed down in this movie, and there's some really great and incisive scenes that I think also pointed to what the rest of the movie was lacking, or what the rest of the movie was playing up. And the basics of what I'm trying to say are that I think people like to go to the theater to watch other to determine like what they would do in that situation, or to feel good about themselves. Most popular movies especially don't end with the audience feeling bad about themselves. And I think this movie does a lot of kind of like, I can't believe that these things happened back then, and it was so horrible that that a black man can't eat in a restaurant, and it's so horrible that a black man can't stay in whatever hotel that he wants to stay in. And so it kind of shows how we've progressed so much, and like it's like really kind of like a pat on the back type of a movie, for for everybody, I guess. But at the same time, it doesn't ask as many incisive questions, or as many biting questions as a movie like Black Klansman, or like If Beale Street Could Talk does. And seeing, like I said, seeing all these movies like all kind of like stuff together, it's and I also just watched like I was sick a couple weeks ago, and I watched all of Atlanta in one day, like the whole series, like all of it. It was really, really good. And that show asks a lot of biting questions. So all that shoved together, it's, I'm trying to step back and trying to look at things, from different, we kind of talked about this in Black Klansman. I'm trying to look at things from a different mindset and a different lens. I'm not trying to say that I understand them at all. I'm not trying to say that, I'm just trying to listen, I guess. That's the big thing. So, and in this one, in this movie, it just seemed like it was definitely different than the other movies and TV shows that I've watched fairly recently.
We're on the same page to a degree. My question is, should what is happening in the world in 2019 influence what we see about a movie that takes place in the 60s?
But it's made today. Remember that.
Well, it's made today, absolutely. So I'm not saying I have the answers to any of these questions I'm getting ready to pose, but these are the questions that have been going through my mind. Because what if Peter Farrelly said, I just want to make a buddy movie, but this is the buddy movie I want to make with these two extremely well-written characters, first of all. Second of all, extremely well acted, as you've already mentioned. Viggo Mortensen, if you look at him in this and then go watch Captain Fantastic, they're not even related to each other, not even in the same century. Obviously, they're not in the same decade, but they're not the same person. That cannot be the same person. And I'm not just talking about the weight gain. I'm not talking about the obvious stereotypical dialect, which I need to get back to, by the way. But an impeccable, almost, I would say perfectly woven performance by Mahershala Ali. It is so meticulously done. It makes me as envious of him as an acting talent then I can't believe somebody can do what he does. And you put that performance up against his performance in Moonlight, up against his performance in House of Cards, and everything else that he's done, and you go, okay, that guy looks a lot like the guy who's the drug dealer in Moonlight, but they're not related. They're not the same person. So, I could spend the rest of the podcast gushing about their performances, and obviously that's my interest, my hobby. But my question comes back to, well, maybe Peter Farrelly just wanted to make a movie about two guys, and this was the story. This did happen. These things did happen. How do you go about telling it without having this huge backlash that you know is going to happen? It happens in every single one of these movies. What I need to figure out, and what I want to figure out for myself is it warranted? Is it justifiable? Or is it just because people are heated about this subject matter that they put these things upon films like this? Is this film pandering to, I'm now a really good person because I like black people now, and I didn't at the beginning of the movie? Or is it pandering to people who think that their life has progressed because it's 2019 and we don't have colored bathrooms, and we don't have colored water fountains, and that's what they're called. Mm-hmm. So we've progressed past that stuff, so we feel good about ourselves. But now we watch a movie where that happened, and it's daunting and it's devastating. And just to see those words in print over top of a water fountain has become a cliche to a degree, but those things happen. So and this story happened. So how do you tell this story and not pander and not fall into cliche and not allow anybody to see the film other than it being about two men in a circumstance out of their control? They're absolutely two fish out of water stories. Obviously, because Tony's from the North and Mahershala Ali is black and from the North, and they're going south, and there's a whole bunch of mess of issues that begin with that. So how do you tell this story and not create something that people put something on that you didn't intend? I'm not saying that people are not justified in what their reaction to this film is. I'm not saying that he didn't pander. I'm just saying, how do you make a film like this and not fall into these trappings? Do you just not do it? Do you just not show the fact that Tony didn't want two black guys to drink from his glasses, so he threw them away? Do you not do that? Do you not do the stereotypical things where they eat fried chicken? Which at first, when that came up, I was like, oh no, okay, here we go. This is going to bug me just because it's been done so many times before. And it is the most ridiculous cliche at this point. But in the screenplay, it comes up later on. And I'm not sure, when they're all sitting around that dinner in that southern house getting ready to listen to Dr. Shirley play, and they serve dinner, I'm not sure that scene would have resonated as much, because they're serving fried chicken, if you hadn't seen the scene before about fried chicken. But I also understand that people, it's not a pretty stereotype. So, not that most stereotypes are pretty, but it's not a pleasant subject. So why put it in there at all, I guess, is the question. But those things existed. People thought that. People assumed that if you were African American, you ate fried chicken and watermelon. That's what they assumed, and that was the stereotype. And even talking about it makes me uncomfortable because I'm not sure where my boundaries are. What can I talk about? So it's unfortunate that this movie has to suffer from everybody's opinion about it and not be about the subject. So my question becomes, is this a good movie for what it is? And I'm at a loss because something instinctually inside me says, it's not that great. It's good, but it's not that great. So is that the reason why everybody is like, they suck for doing this? They put this in here, and that's pandering, and that's a stereotype, and that's this and that. Because there are beautiful things that could be stereotypically shot that are done in a good way. And we'll get to it eventually. I'm talking about the YMCA scene and what Tony Lipps says during that scene. It's handled so well. It's gentle and it's just it's great screenwriting because I have never heard it put that way before. So for me, that was good. So I digress into a lot of things, but my bottom line is then how do you tell the story? Do you not tell it?
Yeah.
Do you not? And then we're robbed of knowing Dr. Don Shirley. I don't know his music. I know more about it now because I've looked him up, but and now for the rest of my life, whenever his name comes up, I have a reference to him and I'll go, oh yeah, I remember hearing this on YouTube, or I remember hearing this on wherever. And now my life is more enriched because I know about this artist. So how do you tell this story, I guess?
Yeah. I will bring up a couple scenes that I thought that were great, and they're especially the one scene when I was like, okay, this movie, does have some things that it's starting to tackle, and I was kind of, excited about those scenes where they weren't overt. Like, so a lot of the stuff, like the fried chicken thing is an overt thing, and it's also something that's easy to stick into a movie trailer, which it was in the movie trailer. So I mean, it's things to like, that are easily codified down into, like, hey, look, check these things out, look how everything's backwards, it's weird. But there's another scene where it's right before Dr. Don Shirley's getting ready to play for his first concert, and he's kind of like going through kind of like a quick pre-show talk with Tony, and he asks him to do three specific things. And he said, we're going to be in this environment with a lot of really, rich people and people who have a certain way of doing things. And he asked him to do these three things. Number one was modify how he dressed, like change how he looked, the clothes that he wore. Number two was to speak more eloquently. The slang terms, Italian terms that he was using, just get rid of those, and don't speak in a more proper manner. And number three was to change his name, because nobody's gonna know how to say Vallelonga. You might as well just like shorten it down to Tony Valley. And each of those things are things that have been asked of any kind of like a population that's not, within the norm. I mean, modifying how you dress, speaking in a particular way. You could draw a direct correlation to, what is asked of African American people, or any other minority group, I guess. Changing your name. I mean, shoot, Mahershala Ali's name isn't Mahershala. It's Mahershala Hashbaz. That's his name. So, but he's shortened it down because it's easier to say Mahershala. So, those types of things. I don't know. I thought that was kind of like a kind of a cool backdoor way of saying, like, these are things that are asked of people to fit in with a certain type of society. But in each of those things, you're hedging your history and your heritage, modifying how you dress, the way you're speaking in certain cases, I guess, and specifically changing your name. I can definitely see that. I was an engineering major at Mizzou at my school, and we had professors from China, and their names were Dominic and Jerome, and it's like, that's not their names. Like, they just came up with a name, and because they didn't, I guess either they were told to do that, or people didn't feel like we could handle saying their name. So I don't know, stuff like that it's crazy. And I thought that was a great little kind of like vignette, a little tool that they used to kind of like show the duality there, and the role reversal of who's telling who what to do in this particular case. So another one I want to bring up really quickly is the horseshoe scene at the motel. It's a little bit later on in the movie. Don, is sitting out in front of his coloreds only, in quotes. I mean, it said that in the hotel that he was at, and they're in a place where he's staying in one. He obviously has to stay in that hotel, whereas Tony can't stay in that hotel. So Tony stays in a different hotel down the street. But he's outside, and a bunch of guys are, playing horseshoes, and they want him to, they want him to help him out. They want to, him to have a fourth. So, but he doesn't do that. So, because he feels uncomfortable, he doesn't feel like he fits in. And then they kind of start making fun of him. And so he goes down the street to a bar and ends up getting beat up. I think it's in Kentucky. I think it's in Louisville or somewhere. But yeah, so that scene also shows that, and he brings it up later on in the movie, that he doesn't feel accepted by any particular group. And so the only thing he knows to do is to fall back into a role, kind of like, I'm not saying he was looking for a fight, but he definitely wasn't not looking for a fight in that bar, going into that bar. So he fell into a role that he, that I'm putting this on that character, I think, at this point, but it's a role that he felt like he could inhabit, based on his skin color, and feel more like what maybe he felt like, feeling more authentically African American. So that's just my take on that scene, but I think that's something that I haven't seen before. It's something that was new and interesting. So yeah, those are just a couple scenes that I thought were great scenes in this movie, whereas I still have, issues with it.
So it's interesting to me that you brought up that first scene where he asks him to dress a certain way, act a certain way, talk a certain way, and change his name. Now, for me, changing one's name in show business is different than changing one's name so people can pronounce it in real life. Although it's based on the same thing. But I got stuck with Paul James. So actually, everybody thinks I made that up to begin with. So I don't have any problems with it, other than people go, do you want to be called James or Jimmy? I go, Paul. And actually, it gives me kind of a leg up a lot of times, because when I'm in interviews or when I've been in casting calls, they'll say that to me. And it kind of brings everybody back to a human level where we're all just humans trying to get through this because, oh, I got your name wrong. And, there's a lot in a name. People have, a history from their family, and their names mean something. So I understand both sides to that coin. I understand changing your name to make a living, and I understand keeping your name because that's who you are. Luckily, I don't have either of those two problems. So other than people thinking I completely made that name up anyway. Oh, let me see your ID. Oh, you could have changed that. Let me see your birth. Really? You want to see my birth certificate? Come on now. This is my name. So I find that interesting. So what makes that not stereotypical behavior in a movie versus something like seeing a scene with fried chicken in it? Because that scene, I think I don't have the education of the subject well enough to speak on it. But for me, that scene was about Viggo Mortensen's character, Tony Lip, trying to explain that Mahershala Ali is missing out on stuff, okay? Because he mentions singers and everybody else, which has been, I've read in articles, something that gives people pause, that a white guy is teaching a black guy about his culture. It bothered a lot of people. But what if, Dr. Shirley didn't know those things? How do you tell those things in a story about Dr. Shirley if he didn't know about it? And I know that the family has disputed a lot of this movie, and I don't know enough about it because I didn't want to really read about that until after we did the podcast, because I wanted to talk about the actual movie. But it does beg the question that, how do you bring those things up? And if you can ask Tony Lips to change things about himself to adapt to the environment, that seems to be something that's refining him. Then is it okay to adapt things to other characters so they can survive in the environment? And why is one frowned upon and one is not? I'm not saying the filmmaker wanted you to frown upon either of those two subjects, but when he did ask him that, I thought, well, that's interesting, because It's a role reversal.
Exactly.
Traditionally in films, it's the other way around. Somebody's asking the black guy to change something about the way that he speaks or the way that he dresses to adapt. So that was interesting. And if that is part of their story, then it needs to be told, because it gave texture to the two characters.
But Tony pushes back, though. Tony's like, I'm not going to change my name. And he doesn't. It doesn't, as far as like how he dresses, I don't know.
And I guess in a way, that's where the difference lies. Tony can say, I'm not doing that. But could Dr. Shirley do that? Could he say, I'm not doing that? He obviously does that later on in the film in a couple of places. And I think that's what you're talking about with the bar scene and the fight. I think it's a pushback for him. And
let me clarify something. I'm not saying that it's a role reversal in that later on somebody asks John Shirley to change his name or do anything like that. I'm saying that that's just it's an allegory for, for what has been asked of, whether it's African Americans or different minorities to modify their ways, their traditions, whatever it is, to be the same as the majority, no matter what.
Right. And I'm saying that Tony Lip, he got to choose that. He got to choose whether or not he changed his name, whether or not he changed the way he dressed, whether or not he changed the way he talked. He got to choose that. But Mahershala Ali does not get to change. Dr. Shirley doesn't get to change where he goes to the bathroom or what they're serving at a dinner, that kind of stuff. So in that retrospect, it's a good thing that you brought up those scenes. But it comes back to the same question, and it'll be the same question all the way to the end of the podcast. How do you tell that story then? If you don't show those things the way that they are or the way that they were in 1960, then what do you do to tell the story? You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You can't tell the story without those aspects. And, there are a lot of the Malcolm X autobiography. At some point in the very beginning of that, they talk about him having red hair and how he's favored in the family because he is lighter skinned and red hair. First of all, I never knew that existed. But there's this thing in the gay community where if you act more straight, you're better than somebody who acts femme. Perceptively, that's what people think. And, there's even all the way down to, advertisements for guys who are trying to meet other guys, straight acting. So if you act more straight, you're more likely to hook up with another guy. It's mind-boggling. And, there's a whole thing about femboys and about effeminate guys and stuff like that. There's all these interwoven stereotypes inside of a minority. And it's interesting how people don't allow you to be you when the whole aspect of just allowing somebody to be themselves is what this culture, this environment of people want. And I think it's important that you pointed out the horseshoe scene. I think it shows something about the character, Dr. Shirley. I think it shows something about the world that he doesn't fit into either. He mentions that later on in the film as well as you did. So it comes back to the same question. If you don't show those things and they did happen, then how do you tell this movie? And I don't think that there's a clear-cut answer how you go about doing it. And there's always been this thing in film history where, Driving Miss Daisy is nominated the same year as Do the Right Thing. And Driving Miss Daisy won. And, a lot of people were like, wait, that's, for me personally, and I don't know if it's the exact same year. I have to look that up. But the other 4 films that won, I like better than Driving Miss Daisy. I have no problem with Driving Miss Daisy. I just think the other 4 films nominated were much more interesting. But so there's always been this thing. And it's like, Boots Riley did Sorry to Bother You. And that is an uber impressive film. And that's coming back up in our life. I know it because obviously we've referenced that quite a few times. And if you're talking about stellar films of the year, that's coming up on my list. No doubt about it.
Mine too.
But he had a problem with the way that Spike Lee did Black Klansman and the truth behind that. So it must be difficult to make movies about important subject matters when all of these people are coming at you in a bunch of different ways. And I don't obviously know any of the answers to any of this. But for me, when I was watching the movie, I felt like and I said this in the beginning, I felt like I learned something about two people that I had never seen on film together before. And I'm sure there's references where, these type of characters are on film together. But for me personally, so the story while I was watching it seemed to work. But I don't know if I'm just looking at it through, rose tinted glasses. And I don't know how to discern for me, non-discernible things. I don't know how to pick them out. So, and it's interesting because we always talk about what we like first versus what we don't like. But all of a sudden, the one or two things that we might not like sort of filter their way through. That's why I don't feel like I'm a film critic. I'm just trying to understand the movie for what I'm supposed to get out of it. We've talked about this a million times before. What I took from it is what I took from it. I mean, it could win all the accolades. It could not be nominated. It doesn't matter. It's what I got out of it. And I've seen this story before, and there's a huge history in Hollywood where, there's stories about Stephen Biko and then it becomes about Kevin Kline, the white guy. And you're like, wait, what? This movie is supposed to be about a South African guy, not Kevin Kline. What's up with that? And it happens over and over and over and over again. Luckily, this film, Green Book, it sort of teeters on that. But isn't it the white guy who needs to learn? Isn't it the white guy who needs to evolve? Isn't it the white guy who needs to know that how he's treating other people is not, the greatest way to be a human? And also Dr. Shirley needs to allow other things into his life so he can adapt that his own lifestyle and his own way of being is not the only way to be. And so he had to adapt and pull in things from understanding other human beings that he might not have. So does it turn into a feel good, everybody loves everybody learns something at the end film? Yeah, it does. And in the cynical world that we live in now, I'm not sure we can actually look at a film like this and not be cynical about it. And that to me is not fair to the movie. But at the same time, there are things in the movie that I went, wait, that feels wonky and that feels weird. And that's, like what? And there's things about Tony Lip that are so stereotypically Brooklyn. But the other side to that is that my parents are from Philadelphia. I spent my summer vacations, my Christmas breaks, weddings, funerals up in the northern region of this country. And you turn on the Jersey Shore and you see these big-haired people with their Camaros that are bright pink with a pinstripe red with Jeanette on it. And you think, are they putting that on TV because that's the stereotype? Then you go to the Jersey Shore and you see Jeanette with her pink Camaro and her big hair and her pinstripe. And you go, okay, so is it a stereotype or is it based on some human being? That said, I know people like Tony Lip. I know people like him. And they do talk like that. And they do act like that. And they do have these grand, big hearts. And they do want to be better than what they've developed into. And they want to progress. So it's hard for me to discern what's a stereotype and what's based on fact and or how a character is supposed to act. Because for me, he seemed like one of my uncles. I mean, I know people like that. I grapple with the fact that how do we tell these kind of movies without stepping on people's toes and without pandering to a dramatic moment that could be real, but we're throwing so many stereotypes in. I'll give you a perfect example, and it's not from this movie, from Hidden Figures, which sort of has the same tone to it. And strangely enough, this film is, well, not strangely, it's interestingly enough that this film is executively produced by Octavia Spencer, who is also in Hidden Figures and received her third Oscar nomination, or second, I think. And then Shape of Water was her third. But when Kevin Costner busts down the colored bathroom sign in the hallway, it's like, okay, the white guy's champion the hallway. Okay, yeah, did that really happen? That didn't happen. And that to me seemed like one of those moments in a movie that's pandering to people to make them feel better about how we've treated people in our life. Green Book doesn't have as many of those moments for me. So in the long run, I think this film's worth seeing, but I'm not sure if my life is allowing me to see it the way that it might be seen by somebody who might be offended by something or who might find that a stereotype. I can't judge it through anything but my experience. So, and I'm idealistic about things. You're realistic about things. I'm idealistic about things.
I'm also more cynical too. And so, I'm kind of looking for angles and things and all that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's probably a way that this movie could have been made and it would have been less of a crowd pleaser and more of like a real character study. And it would definitely not have had as many fun scenes in it, or funny scenes or interesting repartee between the two. The whole letter writing scenes, like those, I thought those were funny and those were great. And I asked Steph after the movie, I was like, how'd you like it? She said, I loved it, and so it is a movie that the last frames, the last few scenes are, you see not only the journey of the Tony Lip character, but also Dr. Shirley has also progressed, and he's kind of allowing people into his life. I mean, that's the key. He's feeling like he's not fitting in anywhere, so he's scared to reach out to anyone. So by being stuck in this car with this, loud, huge Italian dude, he learns about himself. He learns about, a bunch of different things. So it's not, I mean, I don't think it's a bad story. I just think there's, there were some great little scenes in there, and there were some other scenes that were rough. There's obviously scenes you have to have in there. The scene that is regrettably set in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where I live right now. And that was the one where he, is in the middle of a set and in the middle of, playing, and he needs to go to the bathroom, and the owner of the house tells him to go and use the bathroom in the outhouse. And it's just like, yeah, well, that's just great. It doesn't make you feel really great, but yeah, so, I mean, those scenes have to be in there to show to show the situation, in that time. So, I mean, I understand why those scenes are in there, but, and I don't, I guess we can, I don't know if there's really spoilers for this movie, but, we can, I guess, get into spoilers from now on if you're okay with that. So it kind of all comes down to, the whole movie really comes down to the Dr. Shirley character, saying, if I'm not black enough, if I'm not white enough, then if I'm not man enough, then Tony, tell me, what am I? So, and that's really his character. He's had an interesting and unique life experience that took him out of a stereotypical African-American life and placed him in this, unique situation where he was able to thrive and flourish as a performer. And now he kind of feels like a man without a country. What did you think about that scene? I mean, I know that's the scene they're going to play if he gets nominated for an Academy Award.
He will be nominated.
Okay, he will be nominated for Academy Award. Sorry, when he gets
nominated. Yeah, he will, and he could win too. And I'll be okay if he wins. He's not necessarily so far my pick.
Yeah.
But I will be okay with it. It's so, you're talking about Mahershala Ali, right?
Yes.
It's so precise. It's precision. It's just, it's acting surgery at its best. It's just the way he held his head and his shoulders and his hands and his body posture and his dialect and his refinement, where it was part of who he was, not affected. It's just, I mean, and he's a heartbreaker in certain scenes. There are scenes that are just devastating. Back to that YMCA scene, which I want to get back to eventually anyway. The
Yeah.
look on his face is devastating. And actually, the other actor who doesn't say a word, he does his job. I would be extremely impressed with myself if I could handle myself like that actor did. The other guy who's in that scene with him, locked up in the shower naked. He says nothing, but there's multiple stuff you get from that actor just by a look, and that's mesmerizing to me. It goes back to the same thing, Josh. I don't know how to discern what's a stereotype and what's not when it comes to films like this, because if Dr. Don Shirley had these issues in life that he didn't fit in, and he was refined in a different way because of his musical career, and he lived above Carnegie Hall, and he sat on the throne, and all those things that he does, and he eats with his pinky sticking out, and he brushes the side of his mouth with his napkin every time he eats, because he's comes from a different upbringing, or his talent and ability has brought him to a different way of living. So if he does have those issues in the world where he doesn't fit in, then how do you tell that without it being heavy-handed and, like you were saying, questionable? That it sounded a little like you were being not cynical, but you were questioning, well, that's going to be the scene they show from the Oscars, and it was, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know, because I don't know how to go about telling that if that's for real. For me, I personalize everything. So for me, when I saw that scene, I understand that feeling where you don't really fit in. And I think that's what the point of that scene was in general, was that, does anybody really fit in? And if they do, it's usually the worst case scenario. So, you're I don't even want to say typical whatever, group of whatever. But if you walk through this life, you're wondering, do you fit in? Does this make sense? Does, I was raised by Northern people in the South, and I was raised by Northern people who love football, and I love theater. So what? So who luckily love theater now too. And my father's a big advocate of me being in the theater, but it's, not two paths that normally cross. So I related to understanding of one's life through that scene, that you sometimes you just don't fit in, even in the areas where you're supposed to fit in, and I feel that way sometimes when I go to the theater. I feel like I'm very, Northern buffoonish and very over the top, which is kind of a characteristic of people in the theater. But for me, I'm very much like a bull in a china shop, where I'm heavy handed and I knock things over, and I'm not meant to be in this world, but yet I have a desire to be in this world, and people keep asking me to be in this world. And then I'll go and watch a football game with a bunch of my father's relatives. And, I'm not a big football fan. I don't dislike it. I enjoy it. But, they're talking stats, and this guy did this and this yardage and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I feel like this big, like, Spring Awakenings musical guy in that environment. So for me personally, I thought that scene was important because it made me understand something about myself, that it's okay to just be who you are, and the rest of the world will some way catch up. But you do have to adapt, and you do have to figure out how to go about fitting into those groups. Not fitting into, but hanging out with those people. You have to figure it out. So for me, I liked it. I liked that scene. I like that complex understanding of oneself. And I think maybe if I read that scene, I'd be like, I might be a little bit more cynical. And once again, it's probably because Mahershala Ali handles it with such precision that I was like, yeah, I like that scene.
And I think for me, that's kind of what saved it for me was his reading of a line like that, because it's rough for a line like that. I don't know. I guess I tend to gravitate towards more like, I don't know, nuanced movies when talking about issues, and there's not things that are just kind of like, stuck right out there, like a line like that. I mean, he's pretty much like codifying his whole character in one line. At least he's able, as a character, he's able to verbalize that and maybe, move forward as a character, evolve as a character throughout the movie, and maybe that's I guess what's necessary. So
Remember we were talking about Vice and how I was saying that things that are with two characters that you have no idea what they really said to each other in real life, when they write a line for them in the movie, as long as it makes sense for the movie and it's believable for the movie, I can buy into it. And there were a lot of things in Vice that I went, no one ever said that, and that's such a movie line, and only in a movie would somebody say that. So I was very cynical about that in that film. For me, yes, that scene is something only somebody says in a movie, but it sounded like it was real for this situation in this movie. So I was fine with it. Does that make sense?
okay, yeah, it does. So do you want to talk about the YMCA scene?
I do, because I think this is where I lie on the side of the film more so than not, because there are things in the movie, the way that they put things, I had never heard quite put that way before. And once again, I personalize everything, so it might have something to do with that. But there's a scene in the movie where Tony Lip has to go to a YMCA because Dr. Shirley is in trouble. And as you come into the locker room, you immediately get the sense that, this is not good. And you immediately get the sense that this might have been a bathhouse situation, and it turns out it is. And there is a naked Mahershala Ali and another actor, which I don't know his name, who just is impeccable. And if you watch this movie again, watch this guy's small performance, because it is the value of there are no small performances, only small actors is the statement. And he just does his job. So you quickly figure out that they're being retained because they were engaged in some kind of homosexual act, and they got caught. And then Tony Lip comes and gets him out. And instead of this being this huge scene about, oh my God, Dr. Shirley's bisexual, or he's gay, or he sleeps with men sometimes, or he's on the down low, instead of it being about that, maybe this is why the rest of the film doesn't work that much for people, and this scene does work for me, is because when Dr. Shirley goes to explain, Tony Lip goes, I've worked in a nightclub my whole entire life. I know that the world is complicated. I thought, well, and that's not the exact line, but that's basically what he says. I thought, well, that's a really great way of making somebody who's a northern Brooklyn, Bronx type guy dealing with homosexuality, instead of making it about him going, that's disgusting, dude, that's, blah, blah, blah. He shows his heart by saying, dude, the world's complicated. I understand that. And where I come from, I see a whole bunch of different stuff. It's complicated. Let's leave it at that. I don't need an explanation about who you are, who you sleep with. The world is complicated. And I thought that's a really great way to handle something like that. And I'm sure it's only in this screenplay. It didn't happen in real life. But for the movie, that made sense. It said volumes about Tony Lip as a character. It said volumes about who he wants to be as a person, that he can have an understanding that the world's a complex place and not judge somebody else because they aren't who he is, or who he sleeps with, or what he's doing at whatever time of the morning it is or night it is at the YMCA. He just understands that there are things in this world he's never going to understand because they're complicated. The world's complicated. And I just thought it was handled very well. It could have been overwrought, but it's not.
Well, and that's interesting because, he's obviously run across other, gay people in his, I guess just working in the nightclub industry, but it just makes you wonder if it's more like if his prejudices and, were more of a proximity thing where he was around people and knew them and was able to, personify that other type of person. Whereas I guess maybe he hadn't really had much proximity with African-American people, and therefore he was just running on stereotypes and running on just these prejudices that were built into him by his family or his friends or whoever.
But isn't that true for almost everything, though? The more you know something about somebody or subject matter, the more empathetic you are, and that you have an understanding, even if your understanding is, I don't get it, but that's you. that's what you're about.
Yeah, you pretty much got the quote. I looked up the quote here. I mean, they've got quotes on IMDb. Now, I don't know if it's the exact quote or not on IMDb, but you are pretty much, you said it almost exactly right. He says, "Don't worry about it. I've been working in nightclubs in New York City my whole life. I know it's a complicated world." So, yeah, that's what he said.
And whatever they tapped into at that moment, I wish that there were more moments like that throughout the film. That maybe you're right. Maybe this over explanation of things is what the issue is with the film for me. That, having to explain who Mahershala Ali is as a black man by giving him fried chicken. Maybe that's an over explanation that has been used 1,000 times before. I've never quite seen it put like that about homosexuality and somebody from the North and your typical Italian guy who's talking about, gay people. Those are not the terms he would use, but it just allows the audience to go, there's a glimmer of how heartfelt his life is, Tony Lip, and how he can not understand something, but he knows it exists. So you be you, I'll be me, and we'll be good. And I like that. It condensed it.
Did you want to talk about the end at all? I mean, I thought it was a sweet ending, where Don's, driving the car for Tony because he's way too tired after, having to change the tire and all that stuff. We haven't really talked about the relationships, like their run-ins with the cops at all, and how they do make the stark difference between, the cops in the South and the sundown towns, I think is what they're called, which I didn't really know anything about. So that's something I learned from this movie, where if you're black, you can't be caught out after the sun goes down, or else, or else you'll get arrested or you'll get lynched. I have no idea, but just like pretty much like saying these cops saying, don't be found out after sundown, in this town, that's just crazy. But, so, and then once they, move up into the north, they get pulled over again, but it's, for a more, innocuous thing. He's like, "Oh, your tire's low, or your tire's blown." Yeah, I mean, I think they're really trying to like show a difference between the South and the North in that time frame during that, what was the early 60s, I guess.
It could be just simply they're showing that there's a difference between a good person and a bad person, or a person who has allowed their environment to influence them in a bad way or a good way. A cop doesn't necessarily have to be a bad guy in a film like this.
Yeah.
They're just showing that this person's life experience dictated that he's more concerned about this car and its low air in the tire because of the concerns for the people in the car, or the concerns for the people that car might hit if the tire blows out. That they're not everything is a motivating factor by what we have been brought up in this film to believe. And they're actually sundown states existed for counties existed for quite a period of time. So I had heard about them before. I don't think I've seen them represented in a film like this before, meaning it being such a large subject matter in the film, or a prominent subject matter in the film. But, it's mind-boggling that stuff happens and happened. I go back to the same question. How do you tell it in the film without, without showing stereotypical cops, or without showing stereotypical situations? How do you show that? I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I don't know. Something tells me that this movie will get brought up again, especially once we talk about our kind of picks for Oscars, or like you said, I'm sure it's going to be nominated for at least a few Oscars, probably Best Picture, don't you think?
Yeah, and it's already has this huge backlash on Twitter about, I hope this film gets nominated. I hope Green Book and Bohemian Rhapsody don't. Blah, 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 blah. And people have been going off on it. Here's the thing. I can't discern whether or not this is a good movie or a bad movie based on other people's opinions. Not that I ever do that, but sometimes other people's takes on things helps me understand a film in a different way. And are people upset with this film because they find it pandering and stereotypical and subject matter is not handled well? Or are they feeling cynical about its feel good end and how everybody lives happily ever after on Christmas? And I mean, it goes back to what you were saying in the beginning of the podcast that people have been in test marketing films and said, I hate that ending because this person gets away with it. The bad person gets away with it. And they change the ending of the film and it becomes a big blockbuster. So you're right about that. That does happen. So is this film structurally not a good film? I don't know. Is this film, by its nature, a good film? I don't know. Is this film being judged in a cynical 2019 kind of way? Yes. But are they right? And if they're right, then what do we do to tell the story so they're not right anymore? Meaning it doesn't pander, it's not stereotypical. Unfortunately, this is one of those podcasts where I have none of the answers for myself. And maybe somebody will tweet me something that'll make sense to me. But this immediate cynical attitude towards something, just because it's a feel-good movie, I just think it's unfair to the film. It doesn't allow me to understand the film in a different way. Somebody's cynical attitude about it that, it's driving Miss Daisy in reverse and, that didn't feel good. So this doesn't feel good. Well, what does that tell me about why it doesn't feel good? It doesn't. So it's one of those podcasts where I pose more questions for myself and I don't think I answered any of them. I think this film will be interesting to watch after all of it's gone. Win, lose, or draw at the Oscars. We can talk about it on an Oscar podcast, whether or not I think it deserves everything that it's going to be nominated for. But it's going to be interesting to watch this movie 10 years from now and see how I feel about it structurally.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's maybe not going to be as relevant as some of the other movies we talked about recently, but that doesn't mean it's not a good time for most people at the movies. So I can't take that away from, you can't take that experience away from people. Well, you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You can go to facebook.com/actorandengineer and you can tweet us at actorengineer. We'll see you next time.